I think this is week 6, week 7, ballpark in that area, somewhere along those lines. But tonight we're going to look at the judgment of the nation of Israel. And then in the second hour, we'll look at the judgment of the sheep and goats. Just to remind you, what we've been doing is we're kind of tracking the future on 3 parallel trails. We just finished up the future judgment for the church. Tonight we're going to look at Israel's judgment, and then also we're going to look at a judgment for the Gentiles, or for non-Jews, and we'll finish that. So all these things are we're following these on parallel trails, and so we're going to divide that up. After we get through the judgments, then we'll look at the future for the church, future for Israel, and future for Gentiles. And so that's kind of the process in which we've been going. So you see in that opening paragraph, it states that following the rapture of the church and the church's subsequent judgment at the Bema seat, Israel will bear its judgment. But one thing that you're going to notice as we go through the scriptures is that Israel's judgment is much different than the church's judgment, right? Which Bema seat, remember, it focused on the quality of the believer's works since they've been saved versus a judgment of sin. And so what we're going to see here, and becomes very, very obvious in the Old Testament prophecies, as well as when we look at passages in Revelation, that the judgment that Israel has to look forward to is one of great unparalleled, right, hardship and suffering and wrath that we have been promised, thankfully, as a church in Thessalonians, that we don't have an appointment with that wrath. So thankfully, everything that we are looking at tonight here, when we're looking at the judgment of the nation of Israel, that you and I can confidently say we're not going to be participating. We're not going to be here. And that's something to be very, very grateful for. And this just kind of goes with, I know this is a little bit off the reservation, if you will, but we were talking about this on Wednesday evening. We know that all Scripture is profitable, right? And it's profitable in different ways depending on the passage of Scripture. And many times what we learn about in the Old Testament, particularly in some of the, think of a book like Leviticus, that people tend to get, everybody's plans for reading through the Bible in a year tend to die its death in Leviticus, right? Or many of those aspirations have died in the book of Leviticus. But I think one of the reasons that people get bogged down in that book is because we tend to look at Scripture like, well, how's this going to affect me? How does it impact my life? And Leviticus doesn't really impact your life for how you relate to your wife, or how to make a decision on where to move or what God's will is for your life. But it can impact your life when you take it side by side with what God has for the church, and you look at what Israel had and what they had to live by, and what they had, all the steps they had to go through in order to be able to approach God. And then we look at what we've been told is that we can approach God confidently, right, at the throne of grace. And so it's not dependent on what we accomplish. It's not dependent on what we've done. It's dependent on what Christ has done. And so if you're able to look at a book like Leviticus like that, and you compare it with what God has provided us in the church, it can actually be a liberating thing. You're like, man, I am so glad, right, that I wasn't born during this time period, right? I wasn't a Jew under law, because it was excessive. It was oppressive. And so even though we won't be here, thankfully, it can give us an appreciation, right, for what we've been promised and what we looked at as it pertains to the rapture. That our judgment is one of grace, whereas Israel's is not, right? It's a judgment for sin. So we're looking at this idea of Israel's judgment, and we can see as far back in Deuteronomy chapter 4. In Deuteronomy would be the book in which we have this giving of the law, right? This recounting of the law that God gave to the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. We go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4. We actually see just this allusion to this future time of judgment that the nation would face. And all throughout its history, right, as you go through the Old Testament, you see there's periods of judgment, right? You have the book of Judges. You have the Babylonian captivity. You have the Assyrian captivity. So they're all along the way, because of their transgressions, because of their violating the Mosaic law, there were time periods in which they did suffer. They did suffer chastisement and punishment by the hands of God, if you will. But there's coming a time we see prophesied that doesn't match up with any of those things. Something that far exceeds the Babylonian and the Assyrian judgments, far exceeds the time of Judges. Jesus even said that there's nothing comparable to it before it or after it in human history. But let's go ahead and look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 26 through 31. Most of those verses I included in the notes for you because we're going to look at a lot of passages, and that way it might just to save our time. We begin reading in verse 26. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that ye shall soon utterly perish from off the land whereunto ye go over Jordan to possess it. Ye shall not prolong your days upon it, but shall utterly be destroyed. And the Lord shall scatter you among the nations, and ye shall be left few in number among the heathen, whither the Lord shall lead you. So I believe this would be a near prophecy that God was telling the nation of Israel that they wouldn't be long for the promised land. And if we look at their history, right, God he wasn't far off, was he? It was almost instantaneous from the time they crossed over Jordan into the promised land that they began worshiping the gods of the Canaanites and all the other surrounding tribes, and that there were judgments as a result of it. And then he says here in verse 28, and there ye shall serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. But if from thence thou shalt seek the Lord thy God, thou shalt find him, if thou seek him with all thy heart and with all thy soul. And so what he's saying is here in verses 28 and verses 29, if the Jewish people, after they have been exiled from the land for worshiping and turning to other gods, if they come to a point where they recognize, hey, Jehovah, Yahweh is our God. We need to get things right with him. There is the promise that God makes that he will restore them to the land. And look what he says here in verse 30. He says, when thou art in tribulation and all these things come upon thee, and look at this little statement here, even in the latter days. So he's talking about some judgments that are going to happen that are kind of contemporary to the writing of this. And then he talks about that there's going to be some things, similar things that happen in the latter days. He says, if thou turn to the Lord thy God and shalt be obedient unto his voice, for the Lord thy God is a merciful God. He will not forsake thee, nor destroy thee, nor forget the covenant of thy fathers, which he sware unto them. So we see in those passages there in Deuteronomy chapter 4, first that God established a covenant with Israel that he would not break. There would be time periods of correction. There would be time periods of punishment. But at the end of the day, God was going to fulfill the terms of that covenant. And that the terms of that covenant, the end was that Israel would inhabit the promised land. We also see that God promised judgment upon the nation for their disobedience. When you look at the history of Israel, you see a track record, right? You see this recurring history of disobedience. I was listening to a fella that I'm somewhat familiar with. He's teaching at another church. I was listening to this morning, and he was giving some quotes about the past. And I think I'm going to paraphrase it, but there's a quote about the past by a historian by the name of George Santayana, which is, if you don't learn from the past, we're doomed to repeat it. And so that is the history of Israel, right? They didn't learn from their failures. They didn't learn from the failures of their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers. Shortly after God restoring them to the land or restoring them to the blessings of the Mosaic covenant, they would inevitably fall back into idolatry and violating the terms of the Mosaic covenant. But this disobedience, it culminated in rejecting Christ, right? I mean, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. Because here is God ultimately fulfilling these promises to them, right? By sending the Messiah, the promised anointed one. God comes in human flesh. He dwells among them. And they say, we have no king but Caesar. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him, right? And so here we have the nation of Israel rejecting God himself. They don't want him. And so this resulted in Israel being scattered among the nations. And not long after Christ was crucified, you have probably about a 40-year time period, the Romans came in. They broke up the revolt. They stormed the walls and busted down the doors of Jerusalem, toppled the temple, and basically shackled almost every single Jew in Palestine and sent them all over the Roman Empire. And this is a fulfillment of these prophecies that we see in the Old Testament, being scattered among the nations. That is when God, right? So you have Pentecost, which happened about 40 years before, that dispersal of the Jews in 70 AD. That is when God pushed the pause button on his dealings with the nation of Israel, and the church began. Right? You have Pentecost, and then you have now, you see that Acts chapter 15, verse 14, where I can't remember if it's Peter stating this or if it was Paul stating it, that God is now taking out from among the nations, out from among the Gentiles, a people for his name. So the question is, God has scattered the nation of Israel among the nations. We do have now in 1948, we do see a reestablishment of a very, very small percentage of the land that God promised to Israel has been reoccupied by the Jewish people, but that is no way near the fulfillment of the promises that God has made. There are approximately 15,700,000 Jews worldwide. I think about 6 to 8 million of them live in Israel. The vast majority of them live in Israel and the United States, but the rest are scattered all over the world. And so the question is, does this mean that God is done with Israel? They rejected the Messiah. They've been scattered among the nations. Does this mean that God's done? He's finished. The church has replaced, let me ask the question, has the church replaced Israel? There is a very popular line of thinking, very popular theology. It's actually in a lot of Baptist churches. It's called replacement theology. You see a quote here by one of their theologians, Gary DeMar. He states that there is not a single verse in the New Testament that supports the claim that there is a prophetic significance in Israel's restoration as a nation. Beyond 70 AD, which was when the Roman forces destroyed Israel, or not Israel, but Jerusalem and dispersed the Jewish people. Israel as a nation plays no prophetic role. The New Testament only addresses Israel's near destruction, never its distant restoration. And so that is, in a nutshell, that is the foundation of what is known as replacement theology. The church has replaced Israel for all time. But I think if you look at the New Testament, Paul would actually disagree with Gary DeMar and replacement theologians. Because all we have to do is look at the book of Romans, chapters 9, 10, and 11, and Paul paints a very different picture about God's plans for Israel. If you start in verse 1, back up chapter 10. Romans chapter 10, what Paul is stating would possibly lead one to believe that God is favoring the Gentiles now and that there is no plan for Israel. And so Paul addresses this, right? He addresses the hypothetical question in verse 1. And he says, I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew. What ye not what the scriptures say of Elias, how he make intercession to God against Israel, saying, and then he goes on and explains his case. But Paul is stating here emphatically when he says, God forbid, I don't think it has the full punch in our English language today as it would have been understood at this time period. But he's like, there's no possibility that God would cast off his people, the nation of Israel. As he goes through the chapter, he finishes up in verses 25 and 28, and we see that right below. He says, for I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery. Okay, so remember, what is a biblical mystery?
The church.
Okay, so we are... Okay, so something that hadn't been or had just recently been revealed. Right, so, and the church was something that was a mystery because prior to Pentecost, right, or really the upper room, there was no revelation concerning the church. So what he's sharing here is that there's something that was only being revealed at that time. And he states that he doesn't want the Roman believers to be ignorant about it. And he says, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits. So there is the potential for Gentile believers, for the church, to kind of stick our nose up at Israel. If we were to think that God's cast away Israel. God's done with them. They rejected him, right? Look all the promises God gave them, and God's done with them. And they said no to the Messiah, right? He's moving on. He's moving on to us. And he doesn't want us to be wise in our own conceits. He doesn't want us to be puffed up, thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought. And he says that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So the fullness of the Gentiles is a phrase that is used to refer to the end, essentially the end of God's, well, basically until he returns. We see this kind of stuff that Daniel prophesied about. But he says that there would be a blindness on Israel, right, about the gospel until God's dealings with the Gentiles is coming to a close. He says in verse 26, and so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. Now, when you see Israel referred to as Jacob, what is the significance of that? Anybody know?
Abrahamic promise. Same time, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that's true. We're going to look at Jacob's time of Jacob's trouble in a little bit. But anytime God refers to Israel as Jacob, well, let's think about the individual in the Old Testament, right? God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. What did his name mean? Supplanter, trickster, deceiver, right? Heel grabber, right? I've seen that. But then God gave him the name of Israel. Does anybody remember how he defines that? Prince with God. And it was significant because it was after the wrestling with God when he finally essentially gave up. I'm going to stop being the trickster, the deceiver, the supplanter, the heel grabber, right? The guy who was always scheming and conniving and trying to get his own way. Now I am going to, I've met someone who is greater than me. And so it signified this change of character. And so anytime you see God referring to Israel as Jacob, he's referring to Israel in its waywardness, in its rebellion against God. And so when he says that he shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob, that's going to refer to this time period of judgment where we're going to see that there is a refining process. This tribulation, this judgment that we're going to look at in Scripture tonight, it is a time of dealing with unbelieving Jews, but there's also going to be a refining process in the lives of those that will actually believe. Verse 27, he says, for this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away their sins. As concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sakes, but as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sakes. So right now, the Jews were very antagonistic to the church, but Paul is still saying, that the Father has a plan for them. They're his elect, they're his chosen, his nation. And he is not going to be unfaithful to the promises that he made to them. So to the answer to the replacement theologian, there are passages of Scripture in the New Testament that point to the fact that God is not done with Israel. He's set them aside for a time period so that he could take out from the nations a people for his name, the church. But when the church is gone, he is going to reactivate or renew, or however you want to say it, take them out of the timeout corner, right? And start begin his dealings with them. But the first thing he's going to have to do is he's going to judge them. So the Old and New Testament both point to this future judgment on the nation of Israel, which will precede a time of blessing for believing Jews. All right, so there is the promises that God made to Abraham and David that will be fulfilled. The promises that God made to Jeremiah, and we looked at that, was that in the fall, right? When Pastor Daniel did the covenants, and he talked about the new covenant, and he talked about the Davidic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant. These promises will be fulfilled, and literally they are promises of great blessing, earthly and physical blessing that will come true. But there is a judgment that will precede that. And anywhere you look at it, you see about this time period of judgment on the nation of Israel. It is prophesied to be a time unlike any other time in human history. And you see there in the parentheses, in the worst way possible. All right. And so let's read here. It's a fairly lengthy passage in Jeremiah chapter 30, but it'll just kind of start giving us a flavor, right, for what this time period of judgment is going to be like. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 1, we see this, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord God of Israel, saying, Write thee all the words that I have spoken unto thee in a book. For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord. And I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. And these are the words that the Lord spake concerning Israel and concerning Judah. For thus saith the Lord, We have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. All right, so he's painting the picture of a time period in which people are so scared that, and it's like their guts are like eating them up, right? Verse 7, Alas, for that day is great. Right? So that phrase is a recurring phrase in the Old Testament prophetic books, minor prophets and the major prophets. That day, or the day of the Lord. These are all references to this future time period of Israel's judgment. And he says, that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble. And so I think that's what you're referring to. This idea of Jacob's trouble is synonymous with the day of the Lord. And he's stating here, and we're going to see some other passages, that there is no other day, and just make sure we know this. The word day, or how the Hebrew language use that, it's not always a 24-hour time period. It can refer, depending on the context, it can refer to a period of time. So he's not necessarily saying this 24-hour time period. Actually, what we're going to see is it's probably closer to 1,007 years is what is referring to, which would include the tribulation as well as the millennial kingdom. But he says that it is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. The he being Israel, right, or Jacob. Jacob will be saved out of that time period. They will go through it, but they will be saved out of it. Verse 8, For it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off his neck, and will burst thy bonds, and strangers shall no more serve themselves of him. But they shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them. So possibility is to look at this prophecy and say, wow, Jeremiah was just talking about the return from Babylon. But now we're going to start seeing some things that couldn't have been true with the exiles returning from Babylon. Because what he states here is this time of tribulation is greater than any other on earth. And then he's stating that David will actually be their king, right? Whom he will raise up, right? David was dead at that time. So he said, well, David will be raised. Verse 10, therefore fear thou not, O my servant Jacob, saith the Lord, neither be dismayed, O Israel. For lo, I will save thee from afar, and thy seed from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return, and shall be in rest, and be quiet, and none shall make him afraid. And I just kind of highlighted verse 11. He says, for I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee, though I make a full end of all nations, whither I have scattered thee. Right? So he's basically stating that all the nations in which the Jewish people were scattered, God's going to deal with them at that time as well. This will be a time of judgment upon the Gentile nations. He says, yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and will not leave thee altogether unpunished. So God is essentially going to wipe out these rebellious Gentile nations, and he's going to put a whooping on Israel, but not all the Jews will be punished. Not all the Jews will be wiped out. There'll be a remnant, is what he's referring to. Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 14 through 18, we see this other prophecy dealing with this. And he says, the great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hasteth greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord. The mighty man shall cry bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. That is just, that's just heavy. That's oppressive. That is, this is a time of unparalleled destruction and just misery. And he's just painting this picture here for the Jewish people. Verse 16, a day of the trumpet and alarm against the fenced cities and against the high towers. And I will bring distress upon men, that they shall walk like blind men, because they have sinned against the Lord, and their blood shall be poured out as dust, and their flesh as the dung. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath. Right? We see those phrases repeated, this idea in Revelation, right? God's wrath is being poured out on the earth. Okay. He will make the whole land shall be devoured by the fire of his jealousy, for he shall make even a speedy riddance of all them that dwell in the land. You just see some notations there, and I think I've already mentioned them about day, not always referring to 24 hours. Verse 15, he stated that it's a day of wrath, trouble, distress. And really, when you match these prophecies in Jeremiah and Zephaniah and these other Old Testament prophecies, when you put them side by side with what we read in the book of Revelation from chapters 4 through 19, they mesh very nicely. Well, I don't want to say nicely because it's terrible, right? But they walk hand in hand. And it's because God gave John some insight on what this revelation was going to be like. We get some new detail and things along those lines. So we see references in the Old Testament. We see references in the New Testament about this judgment, this time period of tribulation. On the next page, we see letter C. This will be a time of purging. Right? So the judgment of the nation of Israel, which will occur during the course of a time period of 7 years. It'll be this time of purging rebels from the nation. And these rebels, they will be unbelieving Jews. If you start looking at the time when God began dealing with the nation, you go all the way back to Exodus, right? And they were delivered from Pharaoh, and they crossed the Red Sea. And sure enough, we see that the vast majority of those that have been delivered out of slavery as the result of those 10 plagues, right? And God's continued provision for them, they just constantly did not believe. right? They were in a constant state of complaining and murmuring and disbelief that God was capable and willing to bring them into the promised land, right? And so what happened to those unbelieving Hebrews in the wilderness?
They died out there.
They died, right? And so that was also a time of purging, a time of getting rid of the rebels, right? A time of getting rid of those who would not believe in God and his promises. And so that's what we see very similar that is going to happen in Israel's future after the church is removed from the earth. In Zechariah chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, Zechariah prophesies that in that day there shall be a fountain open to the house of David, and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. And it shall come to pass in that day, right? Once again, in that day, in the day, or the day of the Lord. But it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land, and they shall no more be remembered. And also I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to pass out of the land. So basically, he's removing all idols out of the land in that day. He's purifying that land. He's refining that land. Verse 8, a little bit further down in the chapter, Zechariah writes and says, it shall come to pass that in all the land, saith the Lord, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third part shall be left therein. And I will bring the third part through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, the Lord is my God. So Zechariah is stating that during this time period, the 7-year time period of God judging his elect nation, that 2/3 of the nation of Israel will be wiped off the planet. And only 1/3 of the worldwide population of Jews will survive those 7 years. And those will be the ones that he has refined, that he has purified them. And these will be the ones that are believing, right? That last verse says, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, the Lord is my God. He, Yahweh, Jehovah, not all these other gods, but the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac. He is our God. That is a staggering number of people, right? Let's just think about this by comparison. Just kind of looked up some statistics today. It is, and these are approximate numbers, but on the eve of World War II, it is believed that there were 16,600,000 Jewish people. Most historians believe that about 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. If you do the math, right, do the ratios, that is only 36% of the total Jewish population on the earth at that time. Has anybody ever been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.? I know there's some other Holocaust museums in different parts of the country. If you've ever done any study on that, or in World War II, I mean, it was a time of just incredible destruction and death for the Jewish people, right? But that's half, right? 36. I mean, that's only 1/3 of the world population of Jews. When we have these Old Testament prophecies, and when Jesus says while he was on earth that this time of tribulation will be unparalleled, it's never been this bad, and it never will be that bad in the future. He's not kidding around.
Hitler looked like a boot camper, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
It showed the other night on the day of Holocaust, was last week, was it sometime?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It showed a German picture of the guards standing out there and bodies all laid out just as far as the picture would let you see. Hundreds of thousands.
It is. I mean, it's staggering. You almost can't believe it, right? I mean, when you see these things. So let's say the rapture occurred this evening. Okay. 2023, best estimate is that there are 15,700,000 Jewish people across the world. Vast majority of them live in Israel and the United States, as I mentioned earlier. But if the day of the Lord began today, and if 2/3 of the Jewish people were wiped out during that 7-year time period, that would mean over 10 million Jews would die. That is just breathtaking, right? That is an amazing number.
Not to mention the Gentiles too.
Yeah, I mean those numbers are going to break that by far and away.
Mortuaries are going to be busy.
But that's a lot of Jewish people that aren't going to make it through this 7-year time period tribulation, because the vast majority of them are not going to say, "The Lord is my God." Right? But that has been true of so many in the nation of Israel, for the thousands and thousands of years that God has been dealing with them. So Roman numeral 2, we see that this judgment. Yes, sir.
In verse 7, when it says, "I'll cause a prophet and the unclean spirit to pass out of the land," is that referring to Satan, maybe?
Is that Zechariah 13?
Zechariah, verse 7, chapter 13. It says, "The unclean spirit to pass out of the land."
That's verse 2.
No, there's one just before verse 8. Oh, maybe
There's
there's
a gap.
Oh, okay, yeah, verse 2. But it does say it in verse 7 as something to the scattered ones. No, verse 2, okay. "And I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to pass out of the land." I guess it's possible.
Satan being bound for 1,000 years, was during that time.
So that will be, it's possible. I would have to go back and do some more digging on that one, Bill. Well, we know in the New Testament that every idol has a demon behind it, right? That's I think in Corinthians it states that. So it's possible that is a reference. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay. So this is a future event, as we mentioned. There are too many details included in these prophecies to have been fulfilled either by the Babylonian exile or even by when the Romans dispersed the Jewish people in 70 A.D. Right? There are just too many details that were not fulfilled completely. And so when do these events occur? Daniel chapter 9 is very helpful to us in understanding the length of time. And there are Bible scholars a lot smarter than me that have kind of been able to nail this stuff down. But we see here in verse 24, Daniel prophesied that 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, which is Jerusalem, to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So there's a lot of things that are occurring here in this just one verse. But he states that it's a time period of 70 weeks that has to go by in order for the sin to be dealt with the nation of Israel, and essentially for the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ, to finally and to anoint the most holy, for him to basically rule and reign in the nation of Israel. Each week is representative of 7 years. So Daniel is referring to 490 years here. What are you referring to? Verse 25, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks." And so that would be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And so I believe that's 490 years from the time period in which they were commanded to return to Jerusalem from their exile until when Christ would come. He says, "The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times, And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. So at the end of the 62 weeks or 62 7-year time periods, Messiah would be crucified. He would be killed. He would be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. So one of the hard things about prophecy is it's not always super clean. And so what we see here is Daniel prophesying these 70 weeks of 7-year chunks. And what we're dealing with, Israel's history went for 69 of those weeks. And when Christ was crucified, that was the end of those 69 weeks. And then you have this pause, right? We don't see the pause in here, but there is a pause before God once again re-engages or reinitiates his relationship with Israel. And that is what we see here in this last week, verse 27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So the prince here is a reference to this one that would come, the Antichrist. And he says that the Antichrist will confirm a covenant with many. That would be a reference to the nation of Israel for 1 week, for 7 years. And in the midst of that week, so in the middle of those 7 years, in the 3.5-year time period, he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, to come to an end. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. And so what's going to happen here is that when God, for 69 weeks or for 69 7-year chunks of time, God was dealing with the nation of Israel. At the end of those 69 weeks, he provides the Messiah. Nation of Israel rejects the Messiah. They crucify him. God says, I'm putting the pause on you. I'm dealing with the church. I'm going to call out a people for my own name among the nations. The rapture occurs. Church is removed. And then now you have this final week, this final 7 years. It is at the beginning of this 7 years that this prince that Daniel is referring to, or we might call him today, the Antichrist, he makes a covenant. He makes an agreement with the nation of Israel. It's a peace treaty. And he says, you're going to be safe in the land. I'm going to make sure of that. But at the middle marker of those 7 weeks, he's going to break this treaty, and he is going to cause the sacrifices and the oblation to cease. Right? So this is going to necessitate the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. And this is also going to necessitate the fact that a restoring of a priesthood and the sacrificial system. Right now, that is inconceivable if the nation of Israel was to start rebuilding the temple. Because if you're familiar with the conflict between the Muslims and the Jews and the Temple Mount, right? I mean, it could start a world or, a war in the Middle East if Jewish people actually went onto the Mount right now, just went up to pray, let alone rebuilding the temple. So for this to be able to happen, something globally and politically has to happen to make this possible. But Daniel, and you're going to see even Jesus is going to state that that this Antichrist, this man of sin, that Paul calls him in Thessalonians, right? The prince that Daniel talks about here, that he will violate that treaty at the halfway mark. And what he's going to do there is he is going to, very similar to the Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes. It was the time period in between the last Old Testament book and the Gospels. They call it the intertestamental period. You ever heard of the Maccabean revolt or the revolt of the Maccabees? So there were these Jewish brothers that started a revolt because of what this Greek ruler did when he basically went into the temple in Jerusalem, forbade them from celebrating this, obeying the Sabbath. He forbade them from doing the sacrifices, and he went into the temple and claimed to be God himself. and he demanded worship. And then he sacrificed swine in there, right? That was what Daniel referred to as the abomination of desolation. Okay. But Daniel wasn't the only one that prophesied this. We actually see this in the Gospels in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 22. It was a little bit too much to put in the notes. Wanted to save a few trees. So we'll just have to look in our Bibles for that. And let's do this. Since that's a pretty lengthy passage, let's go ahead and we'll hit the pause button because we're at the 48-minute mark. We'll get a drink of water. I don't know about you guys, but I need one. And we'll kick back off in about 5 to 10 minutes. Sound good?
In the 70-week cycle, week 49 is the cross?
It would be week 69.
Oh, 69. Week 69?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dan, on
Yes.
that 1/3 of the Jews that survive and are saved, they don't say, are they equally from each tribe? Other than we know there's 12,000 from each tribe, which is only 144,000. But does it say which tribe may have more survivors or not? Or is it more Judah or Judah and Israel?
It doesn't say.
Okay.
It doesn't say. And the 144,000, I believe, is a reference to these Jewish evangelists that are going to go out worldwide.
But that's from each tribe, isn't
Yes,
it?
12,000 from each tribe, right?
So that's
But
all we know.
I have not come across anything where it tells you, is it going to be more of one tribe or another that's going to survive through that. All right.
Where's the Philly